All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Emerging Revolutionary War. Although we are stepping out of Emerging Revolutionary War today to join with two distinguished historians of the War of 1812. And we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart because I am a native Baltimorean. It's good to talk something else besides Ravens football today, which was a disaster.
The Orioles won.
The Orioles did win, so and they actually came back in the ninth, so they flip-flopped usually. Today, though, I'm joined by Jim Bailey, who's now the Chief of Visitor Services and Education at Manassas National Battlefield Park, but he is a former park ranger at Fort McHenry, still very actively involved with the Guard. You may see him up there for certain events like Defenders Day. And putting his reputation on the line with us is Chris Boyle, who's a National Park Service volunteer at Fort McHenry National Monument Historic Shrine, both with the Fort McHenry Guard and as an historical interpreter. He is now a de facto Baltimorean for having lived in the city for 20 plus years. So he just got his Baltimore citizenship card in the mail. Well, with that, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us tonight, and welcome back, Jim, to the Revelry, and welcome, Chris, for the first time.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
So yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks. And so let's get started. First, for all the listeners, watchers, let's get the 50,000-foot view. War of 1812. Bring it into Baltimore, Mr. Jim.
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that the War of 1812 is kind of the coda to the American Revolution, right? You didn't finish it in 1783. We had to come back 30 years later and fight the Brits one more time. But yeah, to get to Baltimore in September of 1814, one has to kind of go back to the spring of 1813, when a very small British naval expeditionary force under Admiral George Cockburn, or Cockburn, as he became known throughout the Chesapeake, entered the bay and then spent the summer of 1813 sailing at will across the Chesapeake Bay, sailing all the way up to the Susquehanna River, attacking Havre de Grace, Frenchtown, Georgetown, and basically raiding at will with his small naval force up and down the bay. And that gave him a lot of really good intelligence as to the complete lack of preparedness on the part of the United States to defend what was really the heartland of the United States during the War of 1812. You know, we tend to think of the heartland today as being the Midwest, right? The geographic center of the country from east to west. But you have to remember, in 1813, Americans thought of the heartland, or the geographic center of the United States, as running from north to south. So the Middle Atlantic, Maryland, and Chesapeake Bay, the national capital, Washington, D.C., is the center of the country. And in 1814, Admiral Cockburn will return with a much larger naval force, and to repeat what he did throughout 1813. And he'll be joined in late summer by Sir Alexander Cochrane, the senior naval commander now on the scene, bringing the British force in the Chesapeake Bay in August of 1814 to just about 50 warships, some of the larger ones being men of war mounting 75 guns each, and an expeditionary force of 4,000 British soldiers under Major General Robert Ross. So Cochrane, Ross, and Cockburn are going to meet, and their goal is to raise as much havoc as possible in the Chesapeake Bay to divert American attention from Canada. There's definitely on the part of the British a sense of the need to dole out some retribution for some of the things that have happened up in Canada. An American militia force burning the town of Newark along the Niagara River in Canada the previous winter, and forcing dozens of families out into the brutal cold of a Canadian winter. But yes, so again, the British goal: wreak havoc, and basically engage in a campaign of terror against the citizens of the Chesapeake Bay. So to take what Cockburn did in 1813 and really ratchet it up so that the citizens of Maryland and Virginia basically appeal to the government to end the war. And with that, I'll take a pause.
Awesome. So they're already so they're in the air. So you have the Navy, the component. Now there is a infantry component with that, right, as well. That's not here in 1813, but it comes back.
Right, and these are battle hardened veterans, right? These are regiments that have fought under Major General Robert Ross in the Peninsular War against Napoleon, and so these aren't. It's not Canadian militia that they're bringing down from up north. These troops are coming direct from Europe. Ross himself still is recovering from a really nasty neck wound. His wife had begged him not to take the assignment in America, but he insisted. When the British Army joins the Navy, as long as whenever the Army's on board the Navy and catching a ride, Admiral Cochrane is in charge and directs affairs. Once Major General Robert Ross lands his army, he assumes full command and control of those troops and whatever happens on land. Admiral Coburn, the second in command of the naval forces, he will accompany Major General Robert Ross on several forays at Hampton Roads, and then of course in August of 1814 against Barney's American flotilla and ultimately the national capital. So even though the Army's in charge, the Navy is right there represented with George Cockburn, and Cockburn and Ross hit it off and established a pretty good friendship.
So the British initially, I mean, everyone knows what they do with Washington, D.C., but they don't march overland to Baltimore. Is that correct? Either Chris or Jim?
No. It's actually interesting. That's actually what, when Cochrane comes on the scene in the summer, one of the first things he does is send I guess an order, you call it an order, out to Coburn to give him an idea of operations in the Chesapeake. He has freedom to kind of go wherever he wants, and he's not sure if he wants to go immediately into the Chesapeake. And Coburn actually, that's his recommendation, is actually once they hit Washington, is to march directly overland to Baltimore. And that's mixed by both Ross and Cochrane, largely because the force that Ross has isn't, I mean, they have 4,000 total soldiers that they can go off of, but they don't have any cavalry. And they have very few artillery. And so Ross doesn't want to risk marching overland between Washington and Baltimore and being out of communication with the Navy. And so really right after the Battle of Bladensburg, burning of Washington, August 24th, 25th, it's Ross that really quickly decides it's time to go. And they start heading back to Benedict. I mean, Cochrane wants them to come back, and Ross is really starting to push them back on because, again, he didn't think it was a good idea to go trying to march overland 40 whatever miles in unfriendly territory.
So they,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say that by that point, with the Battle of Bladensburg, Ross had suffered well over 350 casualties.
Yeah.
He probably reflected on the fact that he had fought that battle very poorly, had rushed into it, thrown his light brigade into the American lines, had hazarded himself on the front lines, and after the burning of Washington, was probably realizing, everything's broken my way. So it's probably a good time to get back to the safety and the heavy guns of the fleet.
So it's an amazing point that most people don't even realize. I guess some Americans actually did shoot at Bladensburg. You always hear that it's the races and they go. So I mean, it's 350 doesn't sound like a lot of casualties, but when you only have a 4,000 man force and there's no chance for reinforcements as well. It's also August. These men have come across 3,000 miles across the water, and so I mean you have those considerations as well. So most people think, oh, from DC to Baltimore, unless you go at rush hour today, it's not too bad of a trip. But at that time you have those considerations. So you did march back. So from DC, where do they load up to go back up to Chesapeake? Is it out toward like Chestertown or if I miss, I'm getting tongue-tied.
They're going down. They're going back south down to the Patuxent River.
Right.
And then Benedict, the town of Benedict on the Patuxent.
Right. They load up at Benedict, and the Navy goes back down the Patuxent, and they are essentially rendezvousing down off of it's Tangier Island, I guess, right? So they're down off of south off of the bottom of the Patuxent, and then they have to wait because one of the squadrons that goes up the Potomac during that operation under Captain Gordon, they have to wait for them to come down because they go in and they force Alexandria to surrender, and then they, just out of really good seamanship and sheer luck, they get down out of the Potomac without really running into a bunch of trouble from the Americans who are trying to set up a defense up along the Potomac from them. And so they're delayed several days. And I don't think he comes out of the bay until like September 5th or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, right. So they're rendezvousing down south in the lower part of the Chesapeake Bay.
The one thing I wanted to say before we move farther away from the Battle of Bladensburg was just to state that the American army that's assembled at Bladensburg actually outnumbers General Ross. Right, there are regular troops. There are troops or sailors of the United States Navy. You have your Maryland militia. You actually have militia from Baltimore that have joined the district militia, the Georgetown militia. You have the President of the United States, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, James Monroe. Francis Scott Key is on the field. You have all the makings of what could have been a successful defense of the city, except for the fact that they waited until the absolute last possible minute to call out the militia. They made no advanced plans throughout the summer of 1813 and 1814. And then tactically, once they're on the field, those 6,000 troops are spread out over 3 different lines that are not in supporting distance of one another. So what could have been at Bladensburg, unfortunately, was not. And so Ross was able to fight a very poorly executed battle and still win. That's not going to go the same way
right
outside of Baltimore.
So it sounds like Bladensburg, they were trying to recapture the magic of Guilford and cowpens from the American Revolution, but
James Monroe smelled black powder. He had flashbacks to being a young, aide de camp, and just galloped onto the field. And when the Secretary of State tells you to post over there, you say,
okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So there it is. James Monroe smelling black powder. You've heard it here first. That's what changed the course of Bladensburg. So myth busting, Jim is here. So you come up. The borders. So when does, I guess, the Americans understand that is Baltimore next, or is that like the logical thing? I mean, they're down in Tangier, Chesapeake. I mean, there's many places they could go. And so Baltimore, why Baltimore?
Jim, you want to take that?
Yeah. 2 things. I think from the night of August 24th, 1814, in Baltimore, they can see an orange glow on the southwestern horizon. They know what that is, right? They know that that's Washington, D.C. Clearly, we have lost. So you don't know where the president is. You don't know what's going on with the Secretary of War. Baltimore realizes, hey, we're on our own. Fortunately, again, throughout 1813 and 1814, the city fathers, the mayor, the Maryland militia, everyone's been having these conversations about what to do, how to prepare. So once that happens on the 24th of August, that goes into effect. And every day, more and more steps are being taken. Meanwhile, while Baltimore is convinced that it is next, on the British side, they're planning to pack up. Cochrane is feeling like, hey, DC was great. Let's not press our luck. I don't want to get stuck in the Chesapeake Bay if a hurricane comes up the Capes. And so he's initially thinking that, hey, we're gonna bug out. It's the
and
fact
he even goes and begins ordering the fleet to disperse.
Right.
And that's another piece of it, is that he's ready to go, because he has, again, because he can go kind of wherever he wants to go. He's indecisive, and so he wants to leave, and again orders that. But then I'm sure Jim was going to jump into this as well, is that he changes, his mind is changed, or he changes his mind. I think that it's really unclear as to exactly how that happens, but he's convinced, he's convinced.
I think there were 2 things really that kind of caused Cochrane to change his mind. One was he realized that at that point the tides were not favorable for trying to get the fleet out of the Chesapeake Bay, right? So it's like, okay, we need to hang around for another week or two. The other thing was, as they are rendezvousing with Gordon's fleet from the Potomac, and he's getting ready to kind of throw the towel in, the HMS Menelaus, which was sent up the bay towards Baltimore, comes back with the news that there's basically nothing at Baltimore, right? The eastern approaches to the city are open. There's no entrenchment there. There are no forts other than Fort McHenry. And the captain of the HMS Menelaus, in a tender, actually seized a boat laden with fruit within gunshot or a mile and a half of Fort McHenry. Yeah. So this intelligence, for Cochrane, is like, well, I got to hang out in the bay anyway, until the tides are more favorable for getting the fleet out. And it looks like Baltimore's even less prepared than Washington. So the change is made. Everyone is recalled that had already been dispersed, and they start beating their way up the Chesapeake Bay. So the key is that it ends up being just over 2.5 weeks between the burning of Washington and the British attack on Baltimore. So during that time period of British indecisiveness and then, making their way back up the bay, Baltimore every day has been acting as if the attack is imminent. It's going to happen the next day. So troops are pouring in from all over the state. Volunteers are coming in from Virginia and Pennsylvania. Entrenchments are being dug east of the city. Naval heroes like Commodore John Rogers, Oliver Hazard Perry are coming into the city. And so Baltimore, if you read the newspapers, there's a big ebb and flow, from day to day. One day, there's a lot of esprit de corps in the city. Everyone kind of takes note of that. And then the next day, it's all despair and gloominess, and everyone's depressed about their chances. But that key is that time. In that time, entrenchments are dug. You literally have bricklayers making ovens behind the trenches. You have bakers that are coming out using those new ovens and just churning out thousands of loaves of bread. You have other citizens who are preparing bandages, stockpiling pickaxes and wheelbarrows and shovels for the digging of those entrenchments.
They're filling cartridges and ammunition at Fort McHenry, because
most of them are putting up loans.
Right. Most of the militia that shows up, especially those that are coming down from Pennsylvania, they don't have any, some don't have equipment, or they don't have ammunition because they were assuming that they would get it when they would get there. It's funny. It's sort of, not to jump ahead, but the same thing happens in 1861, right, with the beginning of the Civil War. But the militia shows up and they're not sure, they don't have what they need, and so this is all being put together over this 2.5 week period.
I don't know that they've heard about the Civil War and emerging Revolutionary War.
No, I'm not sure. It hasn't happened yet.
No. We always try to say, when will a Civil War reference make its way into one of these Rev Wars Zoom? So we made it 20 minutes right now.
Yeah,
but before we leave completely, and this guy does go from DC to Baltimore, we did have a question come in. You mentioned Francis Scott Key being on the battlefield of Bladensburg. What tactical advantage possibly did he bring to the battle? I think it's none. But,
tactical disadvantage.
Disadvantage there. He's just a member of one of the Georgetown militia or one of the.
He attached himself as a voluntary aide de camp to the I believe it was the Georgetown militia.
There it is.
He was well known. He was a well respected lawyer. Everyone knew him. I mean, everyone knew everyone in DC and in Georgetown in 1814 because it was such a tiny. It wasn't even a city; it was a town. So it's kind of like when James Monroe comes up and orders troops. Everyone knows who James Monroe is. Everyone knows who Francis Scott Key is. Mm-hmm. I don't know that he had much of an impact negatively, but certainly no advantage.
So there you go, Cecilia. No possible disadvantage more than advantage to the cause. But eventually he makes his way to Baltimore too. So everyone's headed to Baltimore.
Key does make his way to Baltimore, but not to be part of the defense of the city. He goes to Baltimore to meet up with John Stuart Skinner, who's the American prisoner of war exchange agent who operates out of Baltimore on the Ferguson packet line between Baltimore and Norfolk, because he's on a mission to find the British fleet and to seek the release of an American civilian by the name of Dr. William Beans, a man that Key knew very well, whose friends had come to Key and said that, hey, look, the British on their way back from the burning of Washington, D.C., they seized Dr. Beans for what they believed was interfering with their orderly withdrawal. What Beans had really done was he had gathered up some other Americans from the town of Upper Marlborough, and they had gone out and corralled or arrested British stragglers who had been breaking into homes and farms and things like that. When one of the soldiers escaped and made their way back to Ross, Major General Robert Ross, he was incensed and ordered the arrest of Dr. Beans. This is very concerning because the British could then, if they wanted to initiate a new campaign throughout the Chesapeake Bay, just start taking civilians and holding them for ransom. So the government's very concerned about what this portends. But what it really comes down to is a personal mission on Key's behalf. He gets all the necessary authorities from the State Department to work with Skinner, and then he leaves Baltimore. I want to say on September the 5th or 6th. I'd have to look that up, honestly. Yeah. While preparations are underway for the defense, and then finds the British fleet. So he is now coming up with the British fleet and Dr. Beans back to Baltimore.
And so now we're into Baltimore. Everyone knows, Fort McHenry and who guards that. And we're going to see if we can avoid another Civil War connection when we talk about if the commander of Fort McHenry comes up. But the militia, so they're busy building defenses. Are there defenses on that peninsula to begin with? And should we talk about who is in command of the Maryland militia, because they're pretty well known names in Maryland military history, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what happens is it's Major General Samuel Smith is in command of the 3rd Division of the Maryland militia, and so he's tasked with the defense of Baltimore, and it actually creates a controversy over command, essentially, because he had not been called into federal service. He's a militia officer, and the commander of the 10th Military District, which is all of Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia, is Brigadier General William Winder. And so Winder obviously is in command at Bladensburg, and we just discussed what happens there. And so in the interim, what happens is the military authorities in Baltimore and the civilian authorities in Baltimore approached Smith, who had been all throughout 1813 preparing the defense of the city, and asked him to be in command. And basically he says, well, he doesn't have the authority. And so they go and go to the governor, who is Governor Levin Winder, who just so happens to be the uncle of General William Winder. Right. And, to try to figure out what's going on. And what happens is the reason that Smith is not, all of Smith's troops are called into federal service when the British show up outside of, in the Patuxent in August, except for Smith himself, because if he's brought into federal service, he'll outrank Winder. And so he's not called in, but all of his troops are. And so after the debacle at Bladensburg, they kind of go over his head, and the Governor Winder again approaches Smith and basically says, well, I don't have the authority to call you into service, but when the militia were called in, we were supposed to choose a major general to serve in the Maryland troops. That's going to be you. And Smith basically takes that as, okay, well, that's good enough for me. I'm going, I can take command. And so by the time Winder, and what Smith wound up doing is he sends a letter to Winder and says, can you send all the Baltimore troops back to the city? And, oh, by the way, I'm taking command of Baltimore. And so when Winder shows up, this is a big issue. And Winder, there's a long thing that goes back and forth, and it's too much for probably an hour to talk about. But there's this back and forth between Winder and the Secretary of State / Secretary of War now, Monroe. And Monroe basically tells Winder, the good of the country is at stake here, and you need to, play good. And so Smith is in command. But very, very quickly, again, this is like August 27th or August 28th, they begin digging these defenses, and they're going to dig about a mile of defensive works to the east of the city, basically anchoring on the Patapsco River down in the, we had a map up, if you're looking at a map, it's the neighborhood of essentially Canton. And it goes up and over this rise of hills to the east called Hampstead Hill. And then it curves over, and the entrenchments actually end essentially where Johns Hopkins Hospital is today. And so in 1814, this is the eastern outskirts of the city. This is beyond sort of the developed area. Smith basically, not by putting all of his eggs in one basket, but, based off of the topography and where the British are assumed to have landed, the area down at North Point on the Patapsco Neck, with the Patapsco River on the south and the Back River on the north, is sort of a natural landing place. And that's really where he had expected the British to land. And so that's why they put most of their work. And so in the matter of this, again, 2.5 weeks, they're digging all these entrenchments. They're mounting heavy artillery. So the Navy that comes in, under Commodore John Rogers, they're mounting again in essentially redoubts along the line. They're mounting heavy naval guns. And then the entirety of the Baltimore City militia essentially has one whole regiment of artillery. And a good number of those companies are also in those entrenchments. And so along that arc, right to the east of the city, you have, I'm forgetting how, but it's almost like 100 artillery pieces. And, by the time the British show up in the river on September 11th, Smith has about 16,000 militia soldiers. Again, the balance is the Baltimore City Brigade under Brigadier General John Stricker. And these are probably the best trained troops in the entire state of Maryland. And they might even be the best trained militia in the entire country at the time, by the time this is happening in 1814, because they've been training all throughout 1813, all throughout 1814. They've been training alongside the regular army at Fort McHenry, both their infantry and their artillery. And again, they're bolstered by the Baltimore County Militia, and Hartford and Cecil County is another brigade. And then there's one whole brigade of Virginia Militia, about 2,000 or 2,500 troops. And then there's some Pennsylvania militia. I forget the numbers, but again, all in total,
It's about 1,000 Pennsylvanians.
Yeah, he's got about 16,000 total that he has in really well done entrenchments. Again, primarily to the east of the city.
And let me put a plug in there first. Samuel Smith knows how to be in tight spaces. Mud Island and up there during the Revolutionary War as the British come up, Fort Mifflin, of course, the Red Bank as well. And then John Stryker's father commanded some of the Maryland line during the Revolution and fought at places like Princeton and so forth. And I also have to put a plug in because John Stryker is born almost right where I'm sitting here in Frederick, Maryland. So there's my little plug of plugging Frederick into the discussion tonight. But
I believe that Smith, he was like one of the last guys to evacuate Long Island with Washington, right?
Yes.
And I think he's also at White Plains before he's wounded at Fort Mifflin, right?
Yeah, shell comes and hits. I think he's sitting in the one officer's quarters and hits the brick fireplace and knocks into him or something.
I think that plays into this, right? That Smith is part of the city's preparations throughout 1813 and 1814. Smith has been working with Major George Armistead at Fort McHenry in 13 and 14. He's the one that pushed Stricker's 3rd Brigade, to train heavily at Fort McHenry for 13 and 14. So by the time there's this brief command crisis with Major or Brigadier General Winder coming up, there's really no contest, right? For the governor of Maryland, for the city authorities, so Smith's a Revolutionary War veteran. He was an aide-de-camp to George Washington. This guy knows his business. Whereas Winder just lost a battle for the capital. Smith has spent 2 years working with us. He knows everybody. And Smith has the endorsement of the regular U.S. Army officer in command of the harbor defenses, George Armistead. He and Winder will eventually pass things up to the point where Winder can take active service of a brigade under Smith. And he's eventually put out on the western defenses over near Federal Hill and what was then called Spring Garden, what today was the scene of a terrible defeat, Ravens Stadium. before his brigade of Virginians and U.S. cavalry are called over to the Hampstead defenses when the British approach.
So that's a segue from the British approach. They come up, they land at North Point, correct? Which is now a state park. Is where they land? Or is
Yeah,
that...
there is a state
Yeah.
park there, but it's actually a county park
Okay.
where they actually land.
Yeah,
Like, the
and
state
part
park
of
is
it,
a little farther up.
and part of it's actually the location of what Fort Howard.
Yeah,
It's part of that's there, and so they swing. It's Old Roads Bay, which it used to be a lot bigger before Sparrows Point, Bethlehem Still, and everything sort of made the bay smaller and all their expansion. But they come in there, they land there. They arrive there on basically the evening of the 11th, and it's at the 11th where Stricker is ordered out, and so he takes his brigade out, and they arrive out in the essentially where the battlefield is, in the location of the Methodist Meeting House, and like 8 o'clock or something at night on September 11th, and the British troops start landing at about 3 o'clock in the morning on the 12th. And it takes them a long time. The interesting thing about, again, obviously we're getting into the point we're talking about North Point. The interesting thing is a lot of what the overarching strategy is these things are not happening in a vacuum. Basically, the British land march from North Point up to the city is supposed to be operating in consort with the naval bombardment, so the Navy coming up the river and bombarding the harbor defenses. And so at least the initial plan is that, Ross's troops are supposed to land, in the morning of the 12th. It's only about 15 miles to the outskirts of the city. And the idea would be that if they didn't run into any trouble, that the army would be in the outskirts of the city, ready to engage whatever defenses they came up against at the time that the bombardment was supposed to begin on the morning of the 13th. And so that these actions would happen at the same time, because and obviously Cochrane, they don't get a good look at the harbor defenses until they get up close to them. But the idea is that the army is going to need the support of the Navy to soften up the defenses and hopefully draw off some of the forces from either the eastern defenses to reinforce Fort McHenry, or the opposite. They might have to send troops from Fort McHenry over to the defenses. So if they're hitting both parts of the city at the same time, they would hopefully be more successful. And what happens is, obviously the engagement at North Point really throws that off, and makes it so that the British are late, essentially, the army is late in getting to the city. But anyway, they land at about 3 o'clock in the morning on the 12th, and it takes them a while because they don't start marching up. The advance brigade and Ross sort of accompanies them, don't start marching up until about 6:30 in the morning. And it's a slow progress because they don't know who they're going to come up against. And again, going back, and this account comes from it's Lieutenant George Gleig. He's a lieutenant in the 85th Light Infantry, and his account, he talks about how we really felt the want of cavalry because they don't have a force that can go out in front, screen, or reconnoiter the approach, and so the infantry has to do that. And so what is supposed to be a relatively quick march is taken a lot more cautiously. And so although Stricker, on the other hand, when his troops get to what becomes the battlefield again the night before, and so first thing in the morning he begins putting his troops into line, and he's expecting the British to hit them in the morning, early in the morning, and the hours sort of tick by in the morning of the 12th, and he's getting reports back from his cavalry. When he gets there, he pushes the cavalry out down the neck, and their job is to start sending back information as the British are coming up, and he's getting the information that the British they're marching, whatever, and that they stop and they're not coming up, and Stricker really gets angry. I mean, if you read his report and sort of what happens afterwards, he's really upset that the British are not sort of attacking him the way that he's anticipating them. Because the march just takes a whole lot of time. Colonel Brooke is, again, another character that comes up in his, I think it's his diary. He talks about how it's so hot. I mean, it's so hot even early in the morning that his soldiers are falling out. I'm just waiting to march because they're waiting on the beaches essentially off of North Point, just waiting for everyone to get off the ship so they can go. And his troops are falling off. And so he actually requests Ross to sort of allow him to hurry up his troops so they can at least get on the road and get into the woods so they're not, just out baking in the sun. But yeah, that's the overall plan. Again, it's the whole idea is they're supposed to try to hit Baltimore from both the land and engage the harbor defenses basically in concert with one another, and that doesn't happen.
So we know what's supposed to happen. The best laid plans always go awry in time of war. So how does the action in North Point begin?
So essentially what happens is, Stricker's plan is, his goal is to essentially slow up the British advance, check their advance and force them to go into battle before they get to the city. Let them know that, if they want to take the city, it's going to be a fight. And so his initial plan is he sets his lineup where he has his, they're basically in the area of the intersection of, North Point Road and the Trap Road, which is the one main intersection in that road network. Both roads lead to the city. The North Point Road is the most direct road. And so he sets his troops up there with one of his regiments, the 5th Regiment, on the right of his line. Again, probably his best regiment. They're all volunteer companies from the militia, and they had been at Bladensburg. And the left of the line he has the 27th, and he has his artillery as 6 4-pounders under Captain John Montgomery, who is not only the captain of this artillery company, he's also the Attorney General of the state of Maryland. So you think about all these people that are coming out to the defense of the city and the state. He's the Attorney General. They're lined up there about 1.5 miles further down the road, closer to where the British are coming, are his riflemen. And behind him, he initially places his 2 other regiments, the 51st, which is his largest regiment, and the 39th, which is his smallest regiment, on a line of about, I forget, Jim, what is about, it's about like a few hundred yards behind, but they're actually placed in, the commander of the 51st talks about this, is they're placed actually in open at intervals so that the first 2 regiments can, when they retreat, can pass through the 51st and 39th. The 51st and 39th then close their ranks and engage the British. And then he has a 3rd line as a reserve, his 5th Regiment, which is the 6th Maryland, all the way another 0.5 mile behind the 2nd line. And so his plan is the riflemen are supposed to bring on the engagement. The 1st line, the 5th and 27th, are supposed to fight. They'll fall back. The 51st, the 39th will fight. They'll fall back, and rally on the 6th of the back at Cook's Tavern. And
I think it's important too to note that the main line of the 5th and the 27th and the artillery, it's not only at that important road junction, but it's also where the North Point Peninsula is at its narrowest, right? So both of Stricker's flanks are anchored by the water, which in theory could be dangerous on his right flank or the British left flank, because the British could bring up small craft and attack. But I think he's gambling that they're not going to be able to maintain that kind of coordination, which they can't. The placement of his line is pretty brilliant. And I think they had spent, Smith and Stricker had gone out in 1814. They'd gone up and down the North Point Peninsula, and they had already decided, like, this is where it's going to, if there's going to be a fight, this is where it's going to happen.
That's where it's going to end up, right? And things kind of go bad, not bad, but they go against his plan very early, because what happens is, as somewhere around about 10 o'clock in the morning, his riflemen start streaming back in. And they get spooked because they think they're getting flanked by, as Jim was just mentioning, they're anchored on Bear Creek, and they think that the British are coming up Bear Creek. And it may have actually been that they were, because at the same time, the Cochrane's fleet is coming up the Patapsco, and they're sending out boats to keep in communication with the British. And so it may have been that they're there. But anyway, they get spooked, and Stricker thinks there's not enough time to send them back out there. So instead, he posts them onto his right of the line, to the right of the 5th, to anchor that flank. And again, time goes on. And finally, about 1 o'clock, right before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he gets a report that the British have stopped at the Gorsuch Farm, which is about a mile and a half down the road, and they're having lunch. And again, this sort of Stricker gets angry. And so he calls again some of his officers, and they decide to send an advance party out, small, about I think of 150 guys. It's basically the riflemen, 2 companies of the 5th, and some of the cavalry, and one artillery piece gets sent up, and they're going to go and sort of try to flush them out. At the same time, this is all happening at the Gorsuch Farm. The reason that the British stop is because they're waiting for the rest of the column to catch up. They've been marching all morning. And at this point, about 3 American militia, artillery, or cavalrymen get brought in and are interviewed by Ross. And Ross says, well, where are the Americans? And they're saying they were just up the road. He said, well, how many of them? They say there's about 20,000. Ross asks, well, who are they? Are they mainly militia? And the cavalrymen say yes. And this is apparently Ross says, well, I don't care if it rains militia. And so he puts the soldiers back on the road. And in these woods, to the east of, or the west of the Gorsuch Farm, the advance party of the Americans run into the advance party of the British, and they start skirmishing. And this is where Ross comes up. And Ross is on horseback, and he rides up to the front of the advance guard to see what's going on. And he Coburn's with him, and their staff officers, and he turns to go and say, I'm going to go and call up the rest of the 1st Brigade, their light brigade. And he's hit with a musket ball that hits him in the arm, and it passes into his body, falls off his horse. And so this is the opening couple minutes of the skirmish that precedes the battle. And command turns over to Colonel Arthur Brooke, and Ross is going to die, or will die, within a few hours. And so again, this is sort of early afternoon. And time is taken for Brooke to get into command and then move up. The advance party comes back. Stricker, at this point, Stricker adjusts his line, and he actually calls up first the 39th and have them come up on the left of the 27th, and then to extend his line, because as the British are coming in, they begin to start probing around to his right, to try to see what's going on the flanks. And at this point, Brooke is now in command, and he's trying to figure out what's in front of him. So Stricker pulls up one of his regiments and realizes that he needs to extend his line further, and he calls up the 51st. And this is where things in the history record starts going bad. But the 51st comes up, and they kind of mess up the maneuver, and there's a little bit of a thing going on. But while this is happening, the American artillery and the British artillery and rockets are trading fire. So there's this artillery duel that goes on for about a half an hour, while the British are really getting into position. That's
huge. I mean, we're talking about 6 4-pounders. So that's a pretty broad front. They're right on the road, right at the road intersection between the 5th Maryland and the 27th. So the heavy casualties that the British Army suffers, I would say the majority of those do most likely come from the American artillery.
Yeah.
Even being 4-pounders. Mm-hmm. British would write that they're essentially, they're firing grape, or a War of 1812 version of canister, which is a bunch of scrap metal rammed down the barrel.
Yeah. And so, the British have about an equal amount of artillery, but they have the rocket, Congreve rocket battery that's with them. And so rockets are shooting off over everything. The artillery is dueling and whatnot. And the 51st sort of makes this so there's two stories that happen here. Stricker says the 51st messes up the maneuver. The commander of the 51st says, no, I got two different orders and they contradicted each other. And so either which way, Stricker extends his line and basically he puts the 51st at right angles to the 39th so that they're facing off toward Back River, not facing toward the British, but they're still catching all of the artillery and the rockets as the British are moving around.
Well, I think it's important too at this point to note that if you are the 51st, you've been in the rear of the line. You're not on the main line with the 27th and the 5th. So the 27th and the 5th, they can see the British Marines, sailors, and soldiers moving off, 100 yards away. Despite the smoke of the artillery and whatnot, they at least know I'm here and the enemy's there. Whereas in the 51st, you're looking at the backs of the 27th and the 5th, right? So I think that psychological component is huge. You're seeing casualties from the front line being brought back to you, right? So it's this faceless foe. And then when you are moved off, you're not moved towards the front, you moved off to the left. Well, why? What's going on over here? And then when you are in position, your vulnerable right flank, as you feel, is off towards the enemy, and you're kind of facing off into this marsh. And what I had read, Chris, too, is that the 39th and the 51st also try to make their maneuvers at about the same time.
Right.
So some of the units get commingled, and this just goes to show how important it is to have that drill, that constant, repetition, that muscle memory, so that when orders are given, people instantly respond. Because on the battlefield, things will get crazy and hectic because of terrain and the fog of war.
Yeah, it's so when Brooke finally launches his attack, so he finally orders his attack for it about 3:00 in the afternoon, and by this point, the 51st sort of has melted away. The part of the British plan is Brooke comes up and he sends the 4th foot along to flank the American around to the right to flank the American left, and the light infantry are put into across the front of the battlefield. The 44th foot is in line behind them, and the Royal Marines and the naval brigade of about 600 sailors are positioned basically to put pressure on the 5th and the riflemen. And I think the 21st is the other regiment, and they take a lot of casualties because they're just in column in the road. Their job is to push through the American line once it falls. And so Brooke pushes this attack, and the 4th starts coming around to the right and pushing on this corner where the 39th and the 51st come together. And apparently the 51st fires like one volley and they run away.
To fire that volley, they would have been probably firing at an extreme right oblique.
Exactly.
At an enemy they
can't see. And part of the 39th goes away too, and it actually leaves 2 guns of the artillery that had been sent out there on their own. And the commander of those 2 guns has to pull his guns off the field. So Stricker has to then fight the battle with basically 2.5 regiments and his riflemen. So it reduces his strength by a lot. And so he's taking on 4,500 British soldiers with I think he says somewhere around the lines, he only has about 2,000 men in the line.
Yeah, I think by the time the 51st and that battalion of the 39th pull back, it's down to about 1,500 men on the main line.
Yeah, and they're sitting toe to toe with the British for about 45 minutes or so before it becomes clear that the pressure that the British are putting on them is too much. And again, Stricker's job here is not to defeat the British army. His job is to slow them up. And he figures it's time to go. And he starts pulling his men off the field, and the British, again, take the field, and they take 1 or 2 of the guns or whatever. And I think what's one of the testaments about how long the Americans actually stay on the field is that the British don't capture a whole lot of Americans at Bladensburg. They capture some, but they don't capture a lot. They capture a lot of Americans at North Point because the Americans stayed on the field long enough for the British to close on them. And if you read the British accounts, it's like it's this rout. The Americans melted away. They ran away. Stricker says, he pulled his men off the line, and whether it's not parade, or anything like that. I'm sure there is obviously some confusion, but I think when the British come and say that they routed the Americans and drove them from the field is a bit of an overstatement. I think that the Stricker's men did well by him, and is a real testament to their training. And again, also just they have the realization that there are more militia behind us. We are not the only line here. And Stricker's men fall back in relatively good order. And about that evening, they're going to pull back closer to the American defensive lines, to the city, and they'll post themselves just outside of the main line on Hampstead Hill.
I think it's really important to remember that these, are, yes, they're uniformed and they look like regulars, but they are citizen militia, right? These are not regular army troops that have been in multiple battles. Although during the War of 1812, being in the regular army was not necessarily a recommendation for combat effectiveness. And keep in mind that up until the war in the militia, that meant, anyone between 18 and 35, and you would muster twice a year. And those musters, are basically, getting the uniform on, doing some drill, parading, all the families coming out and having a picnic. Generally one of the musters is on or around the 4th of July for that reason. So in 13 and 14, when they're assembling at Fort McHenry and going through these maneuvers and through the roll calls and the daily routine, it's more than twice a year. But it's not like they're called out for 6 months at a time. We're talking about a weekend here, a weekend there. So the fact that these citizen soldiers would never, with the exception of the 5th, had not been under fire before, hold for essentially 90 minutes. And, during a good proportion of that, are grossly outnumbered. Is simply amazing. The American Army does far worse at places like Chautauqua and Chrysler's Farm, where they outnumber the opposing British Army. Yeah. They perform far worse and are picked apart by an inferior force far quicker. So the Battle of North Point perhaps tactically could be called an American defeat. But it is truly amazing that they stood as long as they did, especially when you look at what happened at Bladensburg. And I don't know about you, Chris, but I personally attribute that to all of those musters that they did at Fort McHenry in 13 and 14. I think that inspired a lot of confidence in their NCOs, in their officers. It got them used to moving. I think, and that shows where, the 51st being in that open order, and then under fire having to close up and move at the same time was probably what did them in. And the other regiments, handled themselves so well because they started in position.
And they didn't have to move. They only had to move front to back. They didn't have to cut across the battlefield and things like that.
Yeah.
Now, as we of course, like always, we're starting to run a little bit short on time here, but you put historians together, and this is what happens. Now, we have a question that did come in after North Point. None of these militia troops will go to Fort McHenry, correct? They all go to the defenses of Baltimore itself, right?
Correct. Yeah. And their job is basically Stricker's brigade. And then by this point, as Jim had alluded to earlier, Winder is called up. And their job is to, Smith orders them to sort of hang out. Again, if you're from Baltimore, if you look at a map, look at US Route 1, which is Bel Air Road. They're kind of hanging out around there, just to the east of there, to prevent now Brooke and his troops from flanking the American line. And the British are going to spend most of, again, throws off the timing. They don't leave in the battlefield until the morning of the 13th. And so they don't arrive into the outskirts of Baltimore until around, late afternoon of the 13th. And the bombardment's been going on for, 5-6 hours by now. And they actually press some of their skirmishers out and reconnoitering parties out to within a few hundred yards of the Bel Air Road. I mean, they get pretty far into what's today Baltimore City.
Yeah.
And so that's where those troops at North Point end up. They're protecting the line from being flanked by the British.
Yeah, at first they're on the far end where there are no entrenchments, basically refusing the line and being bent back when the British try to kind of look up at Bel Air Road. And when they realize they can't flank the American line, the British contract into a tighter formation to assault the entrenchments, and they move in very close. And when they do that, the brigade of Stricker and Winder, which had been refusing the flank, then moves over and threatens the British right flank, which I think is a very important maneuver, because Brooks sees that, if I advance against this heavily fortified entrenchment with thousands of troops and artillery, I now have roughly 5,000 men in two different brigades on my flank who can come in at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And while Stricker's men don't fire, in that capacity, I think it's important to note that, as Chris had said, they reached the battlefield of North Point on September the 11th. Those guys aren't sleeping very well that night. They get there, they realize that nobody brought any of the camp kettles, right? So there's no way to cook any of the food. So they fight the Battle of North Point, after really not sleeping. They grab what breakfast they can. Then they withdraw back to the entrenchments, and they're on alert the night of the 12th into the 13th. And then throughout the 13th onto the 14th, they're doing these brigade maneuvers in the pouring down rain.
Yeah.
So again, these are citizen soldiers, these are militia, and yet for several days they're operating with basically no sleep and no rations, and they equip themselves very professionally.
Yeah, one of the guys. I mean, just a quick thing. One of the guys whose name is on the battle monument is not killed at North Point, but he actually collapses when the brigade gets back into the city, and he collapses in the street. I wish I could remember his name off the top of my head, but I can't. But his name is on the battle monument. And again, so the same thing, because they're out in the field for 3-4 days. So you can understand why in the years and decades after the Battle of North Point and the attack on Baltimore, that the old defenders, as they were called, were revered by the citizens of Baltimore, and so well into the end of the 19th century when the last of them die.
You made a mention of a monument. We have two final questions, and we can take final comments. One is, what is there to see if people want to go out to North Point? And should they start at Fort McHenry, and that way they visit their national park first? And then you guys mentioned a lot about things that you pulled. What good books would you recommend, or where should people start if they want to read more? So first, let's go with the easy one. What is there to see at North Point if someone wants to venture out? There's
a really nice 7-Eleven that marks basically where the fifth regiment's right of the line was. There's a very small port. It's a state battlefield park. It's owned by the state of Maryland. So there is, and it's basically it is where the I think it's where the 27th.
27th,
is.
yeah.
It's their battle line. There is the battle acre, which is just about 50 or so yards further down the road, and the battle acre is where. Essentially where on the battlefield there had been a log cabin that was standing, and it was in the front of the 5th, and during the battle the 5th Maryland, one of their companies, sets fire to it, and so it's not an obstruction, and so that property is set aside much earlier, like in 1839, when there's a dedication for a monument there. The monument's not actually built, and so there is a small monument with, I think, a cannon on it. But that's really all that's there. I mean, if you had gone there up until the 1950s, it would have looked pretty similar to what it was until it got developed. But unfortunately, most of the battlefield is gone.
The road network is the same. The road intersection
correct.
Is still there. So you can stand on the battlefield and look across at the 7-Eleven and the road intersection and be like, oh, that's where the 6 4-pounders were.
Right.
But essentially what is the state battlefield basically preserves where the 27th stood and then behind them. So, you're looking into the back of a, post World War II, 1950s row home community. And you're looking into a back alley. So you can walk it. You can walk the American line over to Bear Creek, and see, the kind of the five fingers of the creek that featured into the battle. You can't go over to Back River and the marsh because it's now a landfill. So I think your point, Chris, Philip, to go to Fort McHenry and start your visit there is helpful, because you can talk to rangers, you can look at a map, and they can pinpoint where to go. If you're going and you've never been and you don't really know what you're looking for, you'll probably find the state battlefield, but outside of that, the little kind of loop on there, you're not really going to be able to find yourself in specific places where things happen. It's really something you kind of want to walk with someone or talk with someone before you go.
Yeah.
And there's also a small little monument for the first contact or whatever. It sits right outside of I think a garage or something.
Yeah, there's a monument to Aquila Randall, and that's placed basically where Aquila Randall is in the opening skirmish. He's in Mechanical Volunteers of the 5th Maryland, and so he's killed there. And there is a roadside marker where Ross was mortally wounded, but it's been moved a few times, and it historically was not that far from where the Aquila Randall monument was. But that one, yeah, it's down off of the road. Again, it's in somebody's yard, and so it's not. Again, if you had visited there 75 years ago or more, it would have been a whole lot more open. But there's a monument at where the Methodist Meeting House was, and that's again where the troops are usually that's where they're bivouacking on the night of the 11th, and it's used as a field hospital the day after the battle. And it's where one of the American surgeons will go down there after the battle is over to collect the American wounded. They're paroled on the field. The soldiers that are actually captured, many of them are taken out, and some end up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and are released at the end of the war. Some are taken to Bermuda, and they're released in like November. And so, but yeah, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot there left, which again, I think today is why a lot of cases it gets overlooked, because you can't visit it and really envision what's going on. You really have to either walk around or kind of look at the different places where you know that the soldiers would have been, or where the British were marching and whatnot.
It used to be the focus of Defenders Day. Defenders Day is a Maryland state holiday, September 12th, the Battle of North Point. And that was kind of the focus of the anniversaries and the gathering of the veterans throughout the 19th century. A couple of things happened that changed that. One, as you got into the late 19th and early 20th century, a lot of those veterans are gone. Two, you have a new, really national song, the Star-Spangled Banner, that comes into its own during the latter half of the 19th century. Even earlier with the Civil War, and then becoming the national anthem in the early 20th century, and then of course the creation of Fort McHenry National Park, which is later redesignated as Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine, which is why post-World War II, North Point has kind of fallen off the radar to the point where it ends up being developed. It's a travesty, but such is the fate of many a battlefield. As far as books go, there are a couple of popular narratives, and then there are a couple of kind of hard to find collections of primary sources. So the first one is The British Invasion of Maryland, 1812 to 1815, by William Marine. And it's been republished several times. My version is from 1965, but the British Invasion of Maryland by William Marine. That's got a roster of all the militia and some of the original accounts. Another great one is from the United States Navy, the Naval Historical Center, and that's the Naval War of 1812. It's a documentary history. It's primarily naval documents, but because Baltimore was a combined operation on both the American and the British side, it has not only American naval accounts, but it has also all of the militia accounts.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of, again, sort of secondary sources and more modern works. You have Walter Lord's book, Dawn's Early Light, which really, I'm sure we both have it behind us. Yeah.
The Book of the Lord.
Right. And then Stephen Vogel's book, Perilous Fight, is new. There's another book about.
Highly recommend this one.
It's really good. The interesting thing is that there's not that many, because it's not this massive battle, there really aren't that many accounts. I mean, you have Stricker's report, you have, again, most of what we know and most of what we think we know is coming from a British source, is Robert Gleig. And I know Jim's probably going to plug something that there's other primary sources that have just never been published.
You've
or
been
don't
doing
exist.
the research on that. You've been going through finding all these letters in
pension
newspapers
of
of 1814, 1815. You know, as officers of the 51st defend themselves.
Yes,
and basically blame Stricker. Well, and so you essentially have this he said, right? Stricker has the last word because he's the general writing the report, and the officers of the 51st have to resort to writing letters in the newspaper.
And all the senior officers of the 51st, like one is cashiered and then the other two resign, the field officers, after the battle. And it was all, again, the court of inquiry, all of the people in the court of inquiry were all Stricker staff officers, apparently. After the end of the tail end of the war, Stricker's aide de camp is named as the new lieutenant colonel of the 51st. So the politics of it is really interesting about what happens. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of great. It's not a well-studied battle in depth from a military perspective. And so I'm sure there's a lot that can be learned about, if more sources are found or more primary documentation are found. But a lot of stuff, again, there's newspapers accounts, there are clippings. Again, research that I've been doing in looking at soldiers that were wounded because they were in the federal service, they were eligible for federal pensions. And so soldiers were wounded, in the years after the war, requested pensions. And so in that you get some documentation as to maybe like what happened to them. And even then it's really scant. Which again is unfortunate because we get a good macro view of what happens, but there's very, very few at the micro level of really the individual person's experiences of what happened at North Point.
And with that, no, we appreciate it, gentlemen. Any final closing points? I know we could probably go on. We might have to have another War of 1812 Zoom here in the future. But before it does cut us off and we go too far over the hour mark, Chris and Jim, any last final points?
If you've never been to Fort McHenry, visit us. It's a great park. It's we just had Defenders Day. I'll do my plug for Fort McHenry. And again, I think one of the things that we've been trying to do is tell the story a little bit more broadly. But if you have not visited, you have not explored out the areas around where the American defensive lines were in what's now Patterson Park, or gone out and looked at the the battlefield at North Point. I mean, again, there are resources. Go and check it out. It's you're not going to see a whole lot much, but I think that the people who defended the city when they did in the summer of 1814, they would thank you if you did it and went and saw these places.
I would only add to that. I think Baltimore is a case study of the value in preparedness and personal relationships and wargaming, especially juxtaposed to Washington, D.C., where none of those things took place. And I think that preparation, that training, that wargaming, that inner service, cross-training with regulars and militia were really the keys to Stricker's success at North Point. And I would say it is a success, despite having to withdraw. He knew that from the beginning. He wasn't going to stop the British Army. But yes, to echo what Chris said, the Revolution and the Civil War get all the play, but the War of 1812 has the sexiest uniforms.
We'll have to end on
And
that.
on that
Yeah. So thank you everyone for staying with us tonight and joining this talk about the War of 1812, Battle of North Point. Thank you, Chris and Jim, for both lending your expertise. I learned a lot, and the comments are coming in as well that it was very informative and people are looking to get out and see what there is to see. Put a plug in. We're back in 2 weeks on October 2nd for the next Rev War Revelry. Pay attention to the blog to see what that topic will be. This Saturday in Alexandria, the world turned upside down, is the 3rd annual Emerging Revolutionary War Symposium. So check that out. And then in November, there's still a few bus tour tickets left. If you want to see where the formation of the American Army, we'll even talk maybe a little bit about Samuel Smith as well, plugging in there. And so just head over to emergingrevolutionarywar.org. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Once again, Chris, Jim, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and a great experience.
Yeah, thanks. This has
Happy
been
to be
fun.
here.